So I have two different capacities in connection with the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. One is that of education chair, so I chair the education committee. The other is that of local curator for Greenwood Rising, which is a history center that we're building on the southeast corner of Greenwood and Archer. So I had sort of an undeclared major for the first couple of years of undergraduate. And I concluded that going to law school would enhance my options to do a variety of things. And I think I've been proven correct in that regard. So I ended up having a double major in economics and sociology at the University of Arkansas as an undergraduate, and went to Harvard Law School. After Harvard, I came here to work for a law firm that I clerked with the summer of my second year in law school. And one of the interesting things that happened as part of my community engagement, I agreed to write a regular guest editorial column for the Oklahoma Eagle, the black newspaper. And at one point I was asked to do a series on Tulsa's historic Greenwood district, which I did. Became very interested and really wanted to write a book about the community that included a discussion of what was then called the riot, now more often called the Massacre. So Scott Ellsworth, who's now a friend of mine, professor at University of Michigan, had done a great book called Death in the Promised Land about the massacre. That was not my interest. My interest was in a more holistic treatment of the history of the community, focusing on the people. And that's when I ended up writing a book called Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, which came out in 1998. Since then, I've written 9 other books, 3 of which are about Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District. Well, the Greenwood District is roughly a 35 square block area, the historic district, that abuts downtown, separated by the Frisco tracks. It was a community that was rife with black economic ventures and entrepreneurialism. And so, for example, you could come down to Greenwood and you would find hotels and confectionaries, rooming houses, garages, restaurants, grocery stores, movie theaters, dance halls, furriers, pharmacies. You can find a bunch of service providers like doctors and lawyers and dentists and accountants. I think I've always said that Black Wall Street really is a misnomer, because when we think of Wall Street, we think of finance and investment. That was not the character of this community. This was much more like a Black Main Street. These were small business enterprises, mom and pop operations, and service providers. What made it really unique and what made it the talk of the nation was the concentration of this rich economic energy and entrepreneurial spirit in a relatively small, segregated black community that was part of the city of Tulsa. Part of what's really important to understand is that the black community was part of the city of Tulsa. And not unlike many other communities around the nation, the city was rigidly segregated. So the Greenwood community is different only in the level of sophistication economically that was exhibited in the confines of a segregated black community. The Greenwood District sits on lands that were formerly owned by the Muskogee Creeks and the Cherokees. Now, one of the things that's important to understand about Oklahoma generally is the interrelationships between European Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. Most people don't understand, for example, that all 5 of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, the Muskogee Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles, they all engage in the practice of chattel slavery. So they all, to some extent, to a limited extent, had tribal citizens who held people of African ancestry as enslaved persons. So when the tribes were forced to migrate out of the Southeast in the 1830s and 1840s, some of the migrants on those vaunted trails of tears were people of African ancestry, many of whom were enslaved in those tribes, some of whom were free persons and members of those tribes. So that's sort of the first significant presence of people of African extraction in what is today Oklahoma. And that intertwined history plays out in a legacy that's still present with us today. For example, in the Cherokee Nation, there was a move afoot 10, 12 years ago to take the citizenship away from the freedmen, the people of African extraction who had been granted citizenship after the Civil War, citizenship within the Cherokee Nation. Cherokees even amended their constitution. They were sued, and the freedmen, these people of African extraction who had been members of the tribe theretofore, sued successfully in a case called Nash and got their citizenship reinstated. So that is the legacy of the fact that the Cherokees held slaves, sided officially with the Confederacy during the Civil War, executed a treaty with the federal government after the Civil War. Part of the provisions of the treaties included granting citizenship to the formerly enslaved persons and their descendants. 100 years, more than 100 years later, it's still being argued. So it's a really complex relationship, but that's what really makes Oklahoma sort of compelling and unique in a historical sense. Yeah, part of the discussions that were had throughout history, particularly during the 19th century, were of carving out part of what is today Oklahoma for an all-black state. But in the run-up to statehood in 1907, there was serious discussion about carving out part of what is now Oklahoma to be an Indian state called Sequoia. Yeah. So these discussions were had, and they were had with seriousness. People really entertained this notion of carving out these discrete areas on American soil that were essentially, we might call them ghettos for minority populations. You have to remember, Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, was a land mass. And the idea was to carve out part of what is now Oklahoma for a black state, part of what became Oklahoma for Sequoia, an Indian state, right? And the racial realities are such that white individuals in Oklahoma dominated politically and were able to have their way. There were serious discussions at the top levels of governance in Oklahoma in the run-up to statehood about making sure that the black folks and the native folks don't create an alliance, because that would challenge white power in Oklahoma. These were all things that were seriously discussed by folks. Statehood happens in 1907. So remember that the so-called 5 civilized tribes, part of the reason they were called civilized is because they had adapted to white ways, one of which was the enslavement of people of African ancestry. So the 5 tribes in Oklahoma had a history of subjugating black folks. So the possibility of an alliance is diminished somewhat based on that history. For me, the common denominator is white supremacy and white hegemony, right? I mean, we see the exercise of political, economic, and social power on the part of white folks in Oklahoma used to dominate the other people who are here. So even in the nation generally, during this period, sociologists and historians often use the term the nadir of race relations. This is the low point of race relations in America. This is a point at which in Oklahoma, the Klan is beginning and growing tremendously throughout the 1920s. No question about it. Some people say that in the election that followed the massacre here in 1921, every elected official on the ballot had some sort of affiliation with, who was successful, had some sort of affiliation with the Klan. We know that the Klan swelled tremendously throughout that decade. And we know that you can go to the rosters of the Klan that are housed at the University of Tulsa, Special Collections and McFarland Library. And what you find when you look at those rosters is it's a veritable who's who list of Tulsa society. It lists names, street addresses, and occupations. And there are doctors and lawyers and ministers and teachers. All manner of Tulsa society, white society, are affiliated with the Klan during the 1920s. So we have a period of, again, white supremacy, white dominance. And at least arguably, part of the impetus for the massacre is a reaction to the relative success of these black people who are supposed to be inferior. And how can we reconcile this cognitive dissonance we're feeling in a society that elevates white folks and diminishes black folks? I say that the Klan had a significant presence in Tulsa. Do they have a significant bearing on the massacre per se that can be documented? We don't know that. Okay. But we know that the Klan was here, and we know that the Klan was sympathetic in the minds of many, many white folks in Tulsa. Mm-hmm. So there certainly was some connection. The depth of the connection is something we don't really know. Well, the Centennial Commission really is building Greenwood Rising as a world-class history center. So we expect that people will come from far and wide to learn about this history. And I fully expect that people, once they learn about this history, will leverage the lessons from this history to challenge current issues around race, Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, and on and on and on. So that's one thing. It's just sort of generally educating people, getting people feeling not so much comfortable, but equipped to talk about race in a meaningful way, to talk about reconciliation in a meaningful way. The other thing that we'd like to do with the Centennial Commission is what I frame as rekindle the Black Wall Street mindset. In other words, it's not about creating another sort of all-Black entrepreneurial mecca in this geographic space. It's about teaching, specifically Black kids, about their capacity for economic success and entrepreneurialism, and their ability to take that wherever they are in this digital age. They don't have to be physically moored to Greenwood. They can be anywhere, but they can use the icons who created this remarkable community as inspiration for economic and entrepreneurial success wherever they are. Yeah, things are happening. It's just that the constitution of the community has changed dramatically and didn't happen yesterday. It's been happening for decades. So this is a fully integrated community now. Much of the land on the historic Greenwood district does not belong to Black folks anymore. The largest landholder is probably either Oklahoma State University or the city of Tulsa. So the community is experiencing a renaissance in terms of economic activity. Things are happening, things are growing, buildings are being built. The question is, does the character of that current development serve the interest of the history that once existed here? And it's a tough question. One of the great things that we've learned in the Centennial Commission, though, is that virtually everyone we encounter, individual, corporate entity, nonprofit institution, they want to be engaged in supporting the work that we're doing to mark the Centennial. They want to contribute to Greenwood Rising. They want to have a session at their place of business or their entity to learn more about the history. People, Black, white, Latinx, Native, Asian, all people in this community are really engaged around this history at this particular point. And it's incumbent upon us as the Centennial Commission really to leverage that interest and that desire to contribute as we move to the Centennial and through the Centennial beyond it. What happened in Tulsa in 1921 is emblematic of the racialized history in America generally. For example, what happened here in 1921 comes on the heels of 1919. The summer and fall of 1919 were referred to by James Weldon Johnson at the NAACP as Red Summer. Red is a metaphorical reference for the blood that flowed in the streets from this civil unrest. Most of these events were called race riots, but they were largely invasions of Black communities. And they happened in places as far-flung as New York and Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Longview, Texas, Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, and on and on and on. There were more than 24 major events called race riots in 1919 alone. So Tulsa in 1921 comes as part of this outbreak of racial violence in America generally. And the other phenomenon that was happening that caused sociologists and historians to refer to this period as the nadir of race relations in America is lynching. And lynching is nothing short of domestic terrorism. The whole point of lynching is to punish a target or a victim, but not simply that. The larger message is one to the group to which that victim belongs. Most of these victims were African Americans. And so it's an implementation device for white supremacy. We know that
a fear attack.
Yeah, it's to generate fear in the hearts and minds of African Americans, so that they don't stand up for their rights, that they don't challenge white hegemony and white authority. And we know that between the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, middle of the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, there are almost 5,000 African Americans lynched in America. So it's horrific racial violence, particularly during this period, like the 1920s and so forth. The interesting thing about that, though, is that, of course, Greenwood as an economic community was insular. The reason Greenwood existed was it was a community of necessity because Black folks couldn't buy their goods in the larger white community generally, and professionals couldn't ply their trades in the larger white community generally, so they created an insular economy. So even the people who worked outside, like maids, people who were domestics in households, that worked outside the community in South Tulsa, made their money, brought it back and spent it in Greenwood. It really kept the financial foundation of Greenwood thriving as dollars circulated within those confines. People did what they had to do. The tent cities were set up by the Red Cross as a relief effort, obviously temporary. By all accounts, Black and white, the Red Cross did a great job. They were called Angels of Mercy in correspondence from some of the Black folks in the Greenwood community at the time. So residents of Greenwood scrimped and saved, and they got contributions from groups like the NAACP headquartered in New York City and other Black businesses throughout the nation. This was well known throughout the country as yet another example of violence against African Americans, historical racial trauma. And folks just did what they had did what they could with what they had. And they began rebuilding even as the embers still smoldered. There was rebuilding going on. And that's why the story of this community is critical. It's about the human spirit, the indomitable human spirit. The Black Chamber of Commerce, which was called the National Negro Business League, set up by Booker T. Washington, they held their national meeting here in Tulsa in 1925. That's 4 years after the devastation of the massacre. And that's important for two reasons. One, it's a signal from Black leaders nationally that we have to support those folks in Tulsa. And two, it tells us that the community was rebuilt significantly enough to be able to accommodate a national conference here in Tulsa in 1925. In the early 1940s to the mid-1940s, there were well over 200 documented Black-owned and operated businesses here in the Greenwood district. So the peak in terms of the number of Black-owned and operated businesses was not prior to the massacre in 1921. It was actually in the early to mid-1940s. Okay. So it's remarkable. And that's just a testament to the fortitude of people who, even after this really overt racial hostility, would stay here, number one, and would rebound and rebuild, number two, to create something even more grand than what existed prior. It was extremely difficult to rebuild. The city did put up a number of roadblocks. The city, the chamber, the city commission blamed the Black community for the Negro uprising, is the terminology that they used. But we had smart, sophisticated people in the Greenwood community, like B.C. Franklin, who was a lawyer. And yeah, the city tried to make the fire code more onerous. That would have made it difficult to rebuild. But guess what? We had a lawyer who challenged that in court and he won. And so, yeah, roadblocks were there, but they removed them because they realized this is our community, this is our home, we're not going anywhere. So that they had the skilled folks in the community to challenge the things that they had to face. And B.C. Franklin, for example, had a very successful career, lived until I think the early 1960s. You may know of his son, Dr. John Up Franklin. Yes. And John Up Franklin's son, John W. Franklin, worked for the Smithsonian for many, many years, just retired. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking for sort of a catalog of factual information that's been thoroughly investigated, what you should do is look at the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. That was a legislatively convened body that met from 1997 to 2001. They issued a great report. It won awards. One of the things that they spent time looking into was these stories that have been generation-spanning stories transferred throughout history about the bombing of the Greenwood community by airplanes. So then they looked at all aspects of that story. So what they concluded was that private planes were used during the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. The planes did fly over the Greenwood community. The official version is that the planes were reconnoitering. They were looking at what was going on and reporting back. The commission concluded that it is highly likely that the planes dropped at least one of the planes dropped some sort of incendiary device on the community.
Turpentine.
Could have been turpentine, could have been kerosene, some sort of Molotov cocktail. We don't know for sure. The other thing that the commission concluded was that at least one person on one of the planes strafed the community with bullets, who were firing a gun at people on the ground. So the short answer is it's almost a certainty that planes were used to strafe and drop incendiary devices on the Greenwood community during the pendency of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Well, people did what they had to do. I don't know that we know exactly, but I think they probably did what the churches did. Mount Zion Baptist Church, which is still here, one of the historic churches. I like to talk about Mount Zion because Mount Zion was faced with a number of choices after the massacre. So one of the rumors that was being floated during the run-up to the massacre was that Mount Zion was being used to house weapons for the Black community. So when the white rioters came across the Frisco tracks and into the Greenwood community, they went to Mount Zion and torched it. So that Mount Zion was a brand new church built at a cost of roughly $85,000, $50,000 of which was a mortgage from a single individual. The church was totally destroyed. There was nothing left but the dirt floor basement. So then the congregation had a number of choices to make. The first question they asked themselves was, do we still have a church? And of course, the obvious answer is, to the extent that we still have members who are part of our congregation, then we still have a church because the members are the church and not the facade. They asked, did we have insurance on this building? Well, the good news is that, yes, they had an insurance policy. The bad news is that, like many insurance policies during the day, there was an exclusionary clause for damage that was occasioned by riot or civil unrest. And what happened in Tulsa was declared a riot. Another question, is there a way to get out from under this mortgage since we lost our building? They consulted a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I think consulting a lawyer is always a fine thing to do. The lawyer told them about this mechanism called bankruptcy, through which you can reschedule or extinguish indebtedness. They pondered it, but they felt as church members they had a higher moral obligation. They couldn't escape this indebtedness. They owed this fellow his $50,000 back. So Mount Zion, that membership, they spent about 30 years, but they raised enough money to pay off the $50,000 mortgage and to build a new structure. And it's still a vital part of the Greenwood community today. So people had choices to make, and they were sometimes hard choices, but they moved on. They did what they had to do. One of the things that people talk about a lot is the conspiracy of silence, the failure to even surface this history for decades. So there are a few key moments that lift up this history for public discourse. One is an article that was written by a fellow named Ed Wheeler in 1971. That's 50 years after the massacre. He wrote an article for a magazine called Impact. And that got a lot of attention. He got death threats and so forth because people were not talking about this history at the time. Many people didn't know anything about it. The next, I think, critical moment is 1983. Scott Ellsworth's book, Death in the Promised Land, comes out. He's under the tutelage of Dr. John Hunt Franklin at LSU. And that book was really his dissertation at LSU in history. That got a lot of attention. It was a really great in-depth treatment of the massacre called The Riot at the time. 2001, the report of the Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 is released. It gets international attention. From that, a lot of things develop, including local initiatives to address this history. For example, Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry was an ecumenical ministerial alliance raised a small amount of money for symbolic reparations. So they raised, I think it was around roughly $60,000. They identified all the living massacre survivors that they could identify, and they paid them a small amount, just $200 to $300. But it was intended to be a symbolic gesture of reparations, repairing some of the damage. That happened. A number of other initiatives happened after that, and school systems began to get interested in curriculum reform, which is one of the things that we're working on, Centennial Commission. Many books are written. The books elevate the history even further. Like I said, I've written 4 books that specifically address this particular history. And so that has given momentum to what we're doing with the Centennial Commission now. Back a few months ago, we got a little bit of unexpected momentum in the form of President Trump's rally here in Tulsa, which got tremendous media attention. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many, I probably did at least a dozen interviews that week for all manner of publications, print and broadcast. Mm-hmm. So it really elevated the history. And so we know that as we approach the commemorative anniversary, May 31st and June 1st, 2021, we'll have media from all over the world here. We're already doing a number of interviews and so forth. I just released a new book called Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Historical Racial Trauma. That's the one. And the reason I wrote the book is because I know that people who learn about the history or are covering this history as we approach the Centennial will be thinking, what is different about the Tulsa of 2021 as compared to the Tulsa of 1921? So Black Wall Street 100 essentially answers to some degree that question. It talks about all the initiatives, the things that we've done in the community to address this history. It's a work in progress. We're by no means done. We've not always done the right things. We've not always done enough of the things that we do well, but it's evidence for people who want to see that we've not just sort of sat idly by for 100 years and done nothing to address this historical racial wound. Yeah, so the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is the shiny object, but the shiny object is not the be-all and end-all. What's really important is contextualizing what happened. And you can't contextualize it unless you know something about the history of the Greenwood district, the Black community in which it occurred. And beyond that, something about the national history around race. Because that tells you so much, that informs your look at the massacre. And even when you're looking at the massacre, what I think will stand out is individual case studies. That's why I say that the whole story really is fundamentally about the human spirit. It's about remarkable people who had a vision, created a wonderful community, who sustained the community over a short period of time, who suffered right along with the community when it was terrorized in 1921, who were able to summon up the fortitude to rebound and to rebuild after the devastation in 1921, who were able to create a community that was on, after that devastation, on an upward trajectory for many decades, a community that then declined again for a number of social, political, and economic reasons, including urban renewal, including integration. But still, the community moved forward, and we are where we are right now. Yeah, so historically, the original moniker for the event in 1921, May 31st and June 1st, 1921, was the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. Recently, most local media, and national media have moved away from using that historic term that you're going to find when you go back and look at newspapers or when you go back and listen to the interviews of survivors. And they've begun using the term 1921 Tulsa race massacre. For me, what's important is about the critical thinking that surrounds the nomenclature that we choose. So when we use 1921 Tulsa race riot, then we should be thinking, who named this event? Who was missing from the table when the event was named? Once we know the facts, what alternatives might we use? For example, in this case, as opposed to riot, we could use massacre, but we could also use Holocaust or ethnic cleansing or genocide or white riot or assault or race war. There are a bunch of different terms that we could use to describe this event. And we should think about, if the event happened today, what would we call it? My frustration has been the idea that it can only be called a massacre. The problem with that is race riot is a term of art that was used at the time and is used in all the historical references. It's used by the living survivors, most of whom were captured on tape and on film 20 years ago. Race riot was a term that was still being used. The other thing about the term massacre that makes it less than perfect is that some connotations of massacre suggest defenselessness and lack of resistance, which is not the case. There was active, vigorous resistance in the Black community to the mob that invaded the community. It was short-lived because they were outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned, so forth. But there was resistance. It wasn't just a slaughter of people who were not fighting back. So we have to think about all those things when we talk about nomenclature. Do the critical thinking and choose for yourself what term you think best describes it. But don't denigrate other people who choose an alternative. Engage with them in a discussion about these names. Yeah. I think they are the kinds of psychological scars that people suffer from other kinds of trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder. There's fear, shame, blame, guilt. All these sort of psychological dynamics have operated over the years in connection with this event. And I would argue that they're still present with us. Yeah, the difficult part here is that we're talking about something that happened almost 100 years ago. So part of what's important here is a genuine acknowledgement that this happened, who perpetrated it, who suffered, who benefited, who still benefits. How do we strike an appropriate balance that helps bring us back into equilibrium, make amends for the wrongs that occurred? Because when this first began to be discussed kind of broadly, there was more resistance in the white community to owning it and owning the fact that the white community, consciously or unconsciously, is a beneficiary of what happened in terms of the way that it helped structure race relations and the allocation of resources in this community in which we all inhabit. There's been a fairly broad acknowledgement now, people sort of at least acknowledgement in the sense that this did happen and this was horrible. So for me, there's a three-step process that moves us down the road to reconciliation. First is acknowledgement. The second is apology. And we've actually had some of that. For example, former police chief Chuck Jordan, about 7 or 8 years ago, offered a public apology on behalf of the police department for the police department's dereliction of duty in 1921, because we know that members of the police department actually deputized some of the mobsters who invaded the community. He offered a public apology. A couple of our past mayors, Susan Savage and Kathy Taylor, have publicly apologized when they were in the role of mayor, kind of obliquely on behalf of the city. I mean, it's a little tricky because, legal liabilities and all sorts of things like that. But both of them apologized publicly. That's important. Mm-hmm. So we're in the atonement phase, I think, largely. And atonement is the sort of reparations, making amends, righting the wrongs. So I think there's not clarity as to what needs to be done, who needs to do it. I think we're still grappling with that to some extent. For me, one way in which we're atoning is building Greenwood Rising, because collective reparations like that, things that go away toward making amends for past wrongs by educating the public generally, those are very helpful and more palatable to larger swaths of the community. Now, if we were to talk about what often people think about when they think about the word reparations, they think about cash payments to living individuals, either heirs of victims or some living individuals. That gets more tricky. I mean, there's a lawsuit pending right now seeking cash reparations, and there was a lawsuit several years ago that was filed with a lot of fanfare, but was dismissed based on statute of limitations. So going through the legal process to get cash reparations for particular individuals has been problematic, both in terms of institutional resistance and sort of popular discourse. So these, like I said, these collective kinds of reparations are things that I think we can do in the near term. I always tell people when they ask me what I want in the form of reparations, number one for me is curriculum reform. That's actually my number one form of reparations, because it has the opportunity to have generation spanning effect that will lift all of us up and sort of subtly help us right some of the wrongs of the past. Well, as evidenced by the folks in the Greenwood district on Black Wall Street, there's just a certain quality and caliber of people who bend but don't break. They're faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, but they're able to surmount them. Well, anytime we otherize and demonize other folks, ultimately, more harm befalls the demonizer than the demonized. And we can't exist, or we certainly can't exist for very long, if we can't respect the humanity of other people, including people who don't look like us. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate incremental change. I understand that sometimes change seems glacial, and I have witnessed positive change in working through this history, and I've been able to be a part and help facilitate some of that change, and that's gratifying. Because obviously I want to make some small amount of difference while I'm here. And I found a space in which I can do that, and I have done that. There will always be work to do. It's like the notion of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process and not a point. We're never going to get there, but we can each do our own little bit. We can appreciate the incremental growth that we have. Same is true with something like racism. I don't ever expect to live in a world or in America in which racism doesn't exist. But I do expect that I will work toward that in a way that's meaningful and significant. So I want people to understand that the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is happening, that the massacre was emblematic of racial violence in America generally, and that communities all across the country, not just in Tulsa, have much, much work to do in terms of healing from historical racial trauma. It's important that we understand what happened here in the Greenwood community, Black Wall Street, and leverage that history to create a new core of entrepreneurs and businessmen and women who are bold and fearless and can do what they do wherever they are. I've been involved with the Centennial Commission since its inception in 2015. So I personally am not sort of eagerly awaiting an event. This is a process for me. It's a long process. It's going to go on past whatever event we might have to commemorate the centennial. So it's about doing the work that's necessary to elevate this history, to engage people, to get people excited about what was in our past, but also get them more excited about what's in our future and how we leverage that past to get to that future. We're educating people, and we hope that with that education, people will then, each one teach one. Teach other people, be inspired, do something great, all those things.